It was 1978. The laughter started as a low chuckle in the back of the smoke-filled briefing room, a deep rumble from a man who had spent his life around diesel engines and steel plate. The room was deep inside a fortified GRU compound outside Moscow, a place where maps of Western Europe covered entire walls marked with thick red arrows pointing toward the Rhine. On the projector screen, a technical schematic was displayed. It was grainy, likely copied a dozen times from a stolen trade journal, but the details were clear enough. A gas turbine engine. The voice belonged to a colonel, a senior armor analyst with the flat, unimpressed expression of a man who had seen everything. He tapped the screen with a wooden pointer. They are putting an aircraft engine into a tank. The chuckle grew, joined by others. A general seated at the front of the table, his uniform heavy with awards, took a long drag from a cigarette. An aircraft engine? He mused, exhaling a cloud of blue smoke. What do they plan to do? Fly over the full gap? This was the first detailed analysis of America's new XM-1 tank program to reach the Soviet high command. And to these men, the hardened veterans of the Red Army's armored forces, it was not a threat. It was a joke. The colonel continued, his voice dripping with professional scorn. Look at the projected weight, 55 tons. By the time they add the full armor package, it will be 60. Our T-64 tank is 36 tons. Our T-72 tank is 41. This American pig will sink in the first muddy field it finds in Germany. Will be a logistical ball and chain. The maintenance comrades. He shook his head. They will need a team of aerospace engineers just to change the air filters. He was right. On paper, the new American tank was a portrait of Western decadence and technological overreach. It was everything Soviet design. Philosophy stood against. The soul of the Red Army was the T-72 tank. It was a masterpiece of brutal efficiency. It was small, presenting a target barely 2 high. It had a revolutionary automatic loader which fed its massive 125mm main gun. This innovation eliminated the need for a fourth crewman, the loader, making the tank lighter, cheaper, and faster to produce. The T-72 tank was a brawler, a mass-produced steel fist designed to be built by the tens of thousands. It was a soldier's weapon, simple to operate, easy to repair with a hammer and a wrench, and capable of crossing a frozen river or a dusty steppe with equal terrifying speed. It was the physical expression of Soviet military doctrine. The Soviet plan for World War II was a tidal wave of steel. Thousands upon thousands of T-72 and T-80 tanks pouring through the Fuller Gap, overwhelming NATO's defenses through sheer unstoppable numbers. Their strategy was built on the assumption that their tanks were at a minimum equal to their Western counterparts. Against the German Leopard 1, the British Chieftain, and the American M60 pattern, they were confident. The T-72 tank was more than a match. It was, they believed, superior. And now the XM-1, a tank with the thirst of a heavy bomber, a machine so complex it required a logistical tail stretching back to Washington. The GRU analysts estimated its fuel consumption at gallons per mile. It would need to be refueled twice, perhaps 3 times as often as their own diesel-powered T-72 tanks. Is a defensive weapon, the general concluded, stubbing out his cigarette. A diva. It is designed to sit in a prepared position, drink its weight in kerosene, and look impressive for politicians. It will never survive a real war. It will never survive our war. The room nodded. The laughter subsided, replaced by a comfortable, cold confidence. The report was filed. The T-72 production lines continued to run. The Red Army continued to practice its relentless advance. The M1 Abrams, as it would soon be christened, was dismissed as a paper tiger, a boondoggle, a colossal waste of American money. This absolute, unshakable confidence, this monumental miscalculation was a mystery that would remain unsolved for more than a decade. It was a laugh that would eventually die in their throats. This moment of supreme and tragically misplaced confidence was one of the most critical intelligence failures of the Cold War. The Soviets had the data, but they completely misinterpreted the philosophy behind it. They saw weakness, where in fact a revolution was brewing. If you want to understand the real high-stakes stories of the technologies and strategies that define the Cold War, subscribe to our channel, Cold War Impact. The laughter in that Moscow briefing room set the stage for the next 10 years. The Soviet Union wasn't just dismissing the M1 Abrams. They were actively measuring their own success against its perceived failure. while America was pouring billions into this turbine-powered Hangar Queen, the Soviet Union was perfecting its own armored doctrine. The stakes could not have been higher. The entire defense of Western Europe rested on NATO's ability to halt a Soviet armored assault. This assault would be measured in hours, not days. The plan, known as Deep Battle, was a brutal and elegant evolution of the blitzkrieg tactics that had crushed Germany. Soviet tank armies would not bother engaging in a one-on-one fight. They would identify a weak point, punch through it with overwhelming force, and then drive as fast as possible, not toward the enemy army but toward its rear, its supply depots, its command centers, its airfields. The goal was to cause total systemic collapse within 48 hours. The T-72 tank was the scalpel for this operation. Its low profile made it hard to hit. Its powerful gun could kill any tank NATO had in its inventory in 1978, and its autoloader gave it a rate of fire that in theory could overwhelm any defender. Soviet intelligence therefore had one primary job: to assess the threat. To ask, can NATO stop the wave? When they looked at the M1 Abrams, they answered with a resounding no. Their analysis was not stupid. It was rooted in their own hard-won experience. The Second World War had taught them that complexity was the enemy of reliability. The German Tiger and Panther tanks were technological marvels, but they were nightmares to maintain. They broke down constantly. They were produced in tiny numbers. Meanwhile, the Soviet T-34 tank was crude, simple, and rolled off the assembly lines in the tens of thousands. The T-34 won the war. The T-72 was the T-34's spiritual successor. The M1 Abrams, to their eyes, was the second coming of the German Tiger. The GRU reports that filtered up to the Pilot Bureau in the early 1980s painted a picture of an American military grappling with an impossible-to-maintain weapon. They heard rumors of turbine engines failing in the dust of the California desert. They heard of mechanics struggling with new computerized diagnostic tools. They read with great satisfaction of the ballooning costs. This all confirmed their bias. The Americans were building a showpiece. The Soviets were building an army. But underneath this confidence, a small nagging question must have lingered. A mystery. Why would the wealthiest, most technologically advanced nation on Earth, a nation that had put a man on the moon, build a tank that was so obviously terrible? Was it incompetence? Was it corruption in their military-industrial complex? Or was it a massive bluff, a psychological operation, designed to make the Soviets think they were wasting money? The most terrifying possibility was not one they were prepared to entertain: that the Americans knew something they didn't, that the very things they were laughing at, the turbine engine, the massive weight, the complex electronics, were not weaknesses but solutions. Solutions to problems the Soviets had not yet even identified. They had no way of knowing. The M1 Abrams was tested in secret. Most revolutionary components were not its engine or its weight, but the things hidden inside. The things that were not listed on the technical schematics. They couldn't see the new laminated composite armor, a British invention code named Chobam, which had properties that defied conventional anti-tank weapons. They couldn't understand the new fire control system, which linked a laser rangefinder to a digital ballistic computer. And most importantly, they could not see in the dark. The Soviet doctrine was built for a war fought in daylight or under the crude active infrared spotlights of the 1970s. They had no frame of reference for a tank that could see a man-sized target in total darkness in a sandstorm from 2 miles away. The incident was not a single event. It was a decade of compounded arrogance. The mystery was not a phantom on a radar screen. It was a phantom in their own minds. The phantom of American incompetence. They were investigating a ghost, all while the real monster was being born. The Soviet investigation into the M1 program was thorough, meticulous, and completely compromised by its own starting assumptions. The GRU, the main military intelligence directorate, and the KGB's LAR technical intelligence branch activated every asset they had. They tasked spies inside NATO command structures. They debriefed defense attachés who had watched the tank perform maneuvers at Allied demonstrations. They meticulously analyzed satellite photographs of the American proving grounds in Aberdeen and Fort Knox. The hunt for answers was not frantic. It was a cold academic process of confirming what they already believed to be true. When reports of the M1 Abrams's revolutionary Chobam armor first surfaced, a secret British technology that layered steel, ceramics, and air gaps, the Soviet response was not panic. It was skepticism. Their own research institutes like the NI Starley were world leaders in armor technology. They were pioneering explosive reactive armor or Contact 1, a system of bricks that would explode outward to defeat an incoming shaped charge warhead. This, they believed, was the future. It was a clever, lightweight, and brutally effective solution. The American approach, making the tank passively absorb the hit with immense heavy armor, seemed primitive, archaic. They ran the calculations to stop their new Mango APFSDS data long rod penetrator made of tungsten fired at over 1,700 meters per second. A tank would need the equivalent of over 400 millimeters of rolled steel armor. To stop a shaped charge missile, it would need far more. To achieve this with just steel, the M1 would have to weigh 80 tons. Since it only weighed 60, the GRU analysts concluded the composite armor was a bluff. They theorized it was likely a spaced armor array similar to their own but far heavier and more expensive. They were confident their tungsten darts would slice right through. Then there was the engine, the Honeywell AGT-1500 gas turbine. Soviet agents reported back with glee on the logistical problems. The engine's high-pitched whine was so distinct that tank crews joked they could hear it from miles away, ruining any chance of surprise. Its high-temperature exhaust was a massive thermal signature, a kick-me sign for enemy aircraft and heat-seeking missiles. And the fuel, the fuel. The reports were staggering. The M1 Abrams drank kerosene like a drith-rotated soldier drinks vodka. Its range was barely half that of the diesel T-80 tank, the Soviets' own turbine-powered experiment which they had prudently designed with a diesel backup. The legend inside the Soviet military was not of the Abrams, but of their own invincibility. The T-8U tank was their prize. It was faster flying tank. Had its explosive armor. It had its time T-tested 125mm gun which could not only fire armor-piercing rounds but also guided anti-tank missiles, a trick no tank could match. The Soviet High Command looked at the M1 Abrams, and they saw a collection of fatal flaws. Their official conclusion, which dictated their entire war strategy for the 1980s, was a masterpiece of flawed analysis. They developed three core theories. First, the logistical leash theory. The Americans had built a tank that could not fight for more than a few hours without an umbilical cord of fuel trucks. In a deep battle scenario where Soviet tank columns would be moving 50 to 100 kilometers per day, these fuel-hungry M1 Abrams tanks would be left behind, stranded and empty within the first 48 hours. The war would be over before they could be refueled. Second, the brittle glass theory. The Americans had become obsessed with computers. The M1 tank was filled with them. A digital fire control system, a laser rangefinder, a crosswind sensor, and most curiously, a thermal imager. The Soviets, whose own NOI night vision systems were crude infrared floodlights, viewed this thermal technology with suspicion. These complex electronics, they concluded, were fragile. In the brutal reality of a European battlefield, pounded by artillery, choked with mud, rattled by continuous shock, these delicate systems would fail. The tank would go blind, its gun useless. A T-72 tank, by contrast, could be aimed with simple, reliable optics. A peasant conscript could operate it. Third, and most important, was the failed doctrine theory. The Americans, they believed, still didn't understand tank warfare. They had built a defensive weapon, a tank destroyer. It was too heavy to maneuver, too complex to maintain, and too thirsty to conduct a rapid advance. It was a tank designed to sit and wait. The Red Army did not wait. These wrong conclusions were not just theories. They became dogma. They were briefed to the pilot bureau. They were written into training manuals. Soviet tank commanders were taught that the M1 Abrams was a clumsy, fragile, and short-ranged opponent. They were trained to swarm it, getting close where its supposed technological edge would mean nothing. Hit it from the flanks, overwhelm it with numbers. The mystery of the Abrams' true capability was not just hidden. It was actively obscured by a wall of Soviet pride and doctrinal arrogance. They had hunted for answers and found only the ones they wanted to see. They saw a pig. They saw a diva. They saw a paper tiger. They had no idea they were looking at a dragon. While the GRU analysts in Moscow were confidently filing away their reports on the Abrams' fatal flaws, a different kind of work was being done in the dust. Choke testing ranges of the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. Here, the impossible-to-maintain turbine engines were not failing. They were being perfected. The brittle electronics were not breaking. They were being hardened. The Americans were not building a better T-72 tank. They were building an answer to a terrifying mathematical problem. The problem was simple. The Warsaw Pact had 50,000 tanks. NATO had at best 15,000 to oppose them. In any direct confrontation, NATO's armored forces would be numerically overwhelmed in a matter of days. The American solution could not be mass. It had to be mastery. They needed a tank that could kill and kill and kill again, surviving the return fire and killing at ranges where the enemy couldn't even fight back. They needed a silver bullet. The M1 Abrams was not a tank. It was a 60-ton turbine-powered system of silver bullets. The source of this new power was a trinity of revolutionary technologies, the very things the Soviets had dismissed as weaknesses. First, there was the armor. The Soviets were right. The Abrams was incredibly heavy. But this weight was not a flaw. It was a price. The price for a level of survivability that was quite literally alien to Soviet designers. The secret code came after the British design center that had invented it was a revolution in material science. It was not just steel. It was a laminated matrix of metallic plates bonded to ceramic tiles suspended in a composite framework. When a Soviet-shaped charge heat round struck, it didn't just punch a neat hole. The superheated jet of metal plasma was disrupted, ablated, and dissipated by the ceramic layers. When a Soviet long-rod penetrator APF-SDS dart struck, the incredible hardness of the ceramics would shatter the tip of the dart while the composite layers would catch and break the rest of it. The American crews were being sealed inside a mobile fortress. The design philosophy was a complete reversal of Soviet thinking. The Soviets designed their tanks to be small and cheap, viewing the crew as expendable. The Americans designed their tank to be survivable, viewing their highly trained, professional crews as irreplaceable. Second, there was the engine. The Soviets saw the AGT-15,000 turbine as a thirsty, whining liability. The Americans saw it as the key to tactical dominance. In the 1970s, diesel engines were smoky, slow to accelerate, and loud all the time. The turbine was quiet at an idle, allowing the tank to wait in a silent watch ambush position. And when the time came to move, it offered acceleration that was simply terrifying. A 60-ton M1 Abrams could move from a dead stop to 30 miles per hour, 48 km/h, in under 7 seconds. This gave M1 commanders a new tactic the Soviets had never factored into their deep battle calculations. Shoot and scoot. An Abrams could crest a hill, stop, fire its main gun, and then instantly reverse back into cover before the incoming Soviet round fire 2,000 m away could even reach its position. The T-72 tank with its sluggish diesel engine was a sitting duck by comparison. The high fuel consumption was an acceptable trade-off for this life-saving agility. But the final piece, the most secret and most important part of the American project, was the part the Soviets understood the least. They had dismissed the complex electronics as a brittle glass weakness. In reality, they were the dragon's eyes. The M1 Abrams was the first hunter-killer platform. In a Soviet T-72 tank, the gunner aimed the gun and the commander looked for targets. The commander could not fire the gun. In the Abrams, the commander had his own independent, fully stabilized thermal viewer. He could hunt for targets, rotating his Kuela while the gunner was killing, engaging a different target. The moment the commander found a new threat, he could press a button. The turret would instantly slew to face the new target, and the gunner's sights would be laid directly on it. The crew could engage multiple targets in the time it took a T-72 crew to engage one. And then there was the thermal sight itself. This was the impossible technology. Soviet night vision was active infrared. It was a massive spotlight invisible to the naked eye that bathed the battlefield in infrared light. It was crude, had a short range, and most fatally, it was a beacon. Any other tank with an IR viewer could see this spotlight shining in the dark, revealing the tank's exact position. The American thermal imager was passive. It was not a light. It was a camera. A camera that saw heat, not light. It could see the faint heat signature of a T-72's engine, its exhaust, or even the friction warm tracks from thousands of meters away. It could see through smoke. It could see through fog. It could see through darkness. So total that the T-72 commander was functionally blind. This thermal image was fed directly into the tank's digital ballistic computer. The gunner would place his crosshairs on the glowing ghost-like image of the T-72. He would press a button. A laser beam, invisible to the Soviets, would instantly measure the exact range, say 2,500 m. This range, along with data from a cross-wind sensor, the temperature of the ammunition, and even the slight bend of the gun barrel, was processed by the computer in a microcond. The computer would then instantly elevate the gun to the exact angle needed to make the shot. The gunner didn't have to guess. He didn't have to walk his rounds onto the target. He just had to press the laser button, see the fire light come on, and pull the trigger. The first shot was a kill. While the Soviets were practicing their mass charges, the Americans were practicing for a hunt. They were training their crews to be executioners, to operate in a target-rich environment. The Americans knew something the Soviets had refused to believe. The next war would not be a brawl. Would be an assassination carried out from 2 miles away in the dark. The confrontation did not happen in the muddy fields of the Fulda Gap. The two philosophies of tank design, born from the same Cold War paranoia, would meet in a place far from the pine forests of Germany. They met in the vast featureless desert of southern Iraq. The year was 1991. The event was Operation Desert Storm. The Iraqi Republican Guard was the fourth largest army in the world. It was a mirror image of the Red Army. Its officers were trained in Moscow. Its doctrine was Soviet deep battle. Its armored fist was comprised of hundreds of T-72 tanks, the Ural export model, a slightly downgraded version, but fundamentally the same machine that had caused such confidence in that Moscow briefing room. They were veterans of the long brutal war with Iran. They were confident. They were dug in. They knew their business. On the evening of February 26, 1991, the U.S. Army's 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, call sign Eagle Troop, was probing deep into the Iraqi desert. A violent howling sandstorm had descended, a shamel that reduced visibility to less than 100 m. It was the perfect cover, the perfect storm. The Iraqi T-72 tank commanders in the Tawaka division were blind. Their active infrared night vision systems were useless. The infrared light simply reflected off the dense wall of sand. They were safe. Nothing could see them. Nothing could move in this. They sat in their dujin revetments, listening to the wind, waiting for the storm to pass. The shock moment, the incident that finally and fatally solved the mystery for Moscow, began not with a roar but with a whisper. Iraqi crews heard a high-pitched, unfamiliar whine on the wind. It was a sound they didn't recognize, like a jet engine, but it was on the ground. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. Then the world exploded. A T-72 tank in the Iraqi line vanished in a blinding flash. The turret, ripped from its hull by the force of the blast, was hurled 30 feet into the air. Before the crew of the neighboring tank could even react, their tank was hit. A brilliant white-hot lance of depleted uranium traveling at over a mile per hour punched through their frontal armor, flash-boiled the crew, and detonated the ammunition stored in the carousel autoloader. From the American perspective, it was a hunt. From the Iraqi perspective, it was a massacre. The M1 Abrams tanks were sitting 2,000 m away, completely stationary. In their thermal sights, the black rowing sandstorm didn't exist. All they saw was a grid of ghostly white-hot rectangles. The T-72 tanks glowing like beacons from the residual heat of their engines. The American gunners were calm. This was Abedyne proving ground. This was the training they had done 1,000 times. Laser. Laser. Fire. Target. Identified. Fire. On the way. A flash. The gunner watches the glowing hot T-72 tank silhouette disappear in the sight. Target. Target destroyed. I'm on the next one. The Iraqi crews were in hell. They were blind, deaf, and being assassinated one by one. They fired their main guns wildly into the storm, but they were shooting at ghosts. They had no targets. They couldn't see the enemy. They couldn't even tell which direction the fire was coming from. In the battle that would be known as 73 Easting, 9 M1 Abrams tanks destroyed an entire Iraqi armored battalion in 23 minutes. Not one Abrams was lost. The reports that filtered back to a collapsing Soviet Union were not analysis. They were obituaries. The joke from 1978 had become a horrifying, irreversible truth. The logistical leash hadn't mattered. The brittle glass electronics had proven to be the single most decisive weapon on the battlefield. The failed doctrine of the heavy defensive tank had been a lie. The Abrams was an apex predator and the T-72 tank was its natural prey. The Soviet feudal response had already been in motion for years, but it was a response to the wrong questions. Horrified by the M1's new armor in the mid-1980s, they had rushed to develop Contact 5, a new generation of heavy explosive reactive armor. It was designed to break the new American long-rod penetrators. They had also developed the Sphere and Reflex, guided missiles which could be fired from their tank barrels to kill the Abrams at ranges where their conventional ammunition would fail. But these were desperate piecemeal fixes. They were trying to upgrade their biplane to fight a jet. The problem was not the T-72's gun or its armor. The problem was its soul, its philosophy. The T-72 tank was designed to be operated by a half-trued conscript who aimed with his eyes. The M1 Abrams was a system, a network of sensors and computers operated by a professional, highly trained crew. The Soviets' futile response was to pile more armor and bigger missiles onto a platform that was fundamentally blind. The M1 Abrams didn't care, could see in the dark, could see through the sand, and it could fire its first shot, a killing shot, from 3,000 m away before the T-72's crew even knew they were in a fight. The laughter had stopped, the mystery was solved, and the answer was a death sentence for the entire Soviet way of war. The final verdict of the Desert War was not written in an after-action report. It was written in a single, brutal statistic that echoed from the halls of the Pentagon to the last dying chambers of the Soviet Pilot Bureau. The killer statistic was this: in 100 hours of ground warfare, the M1 Abrams tank in all its variants destroyed over 2,000 Iraqi tanks, including hundreds of the top-of-the-line T-72 tanks. In return, only 18 M1 Abrams tanks were damaged. Those 9 were permanent total losses, and of those 9, not a single one was destroyed by enemy tank fire. Not one M1 Abrams crewman was killed by a T-72 tank. The final score was in effect thousands to 0. The joke from 1978 had returned as a ghost to haunt its tellers. The pig that would sink in the mud had proven to be an agile desert warrior. The Diva, with the thirsty turbine engine, had maintained an operational readiness rate of over 90%. The brittle electronics had become the eye of God, and the paper tiger had revealed itself to be a dragon, one that had incinerated the very core of Soviet armored doctrine. This was not just a military failure. It was a systemic and philosophical collapse. It was the moment the Cold War's central lie was exposed. The Soviet Union had built its entire identity on the idea of inevitable material and technological superiority. It had become a superpower through imitation. They had stolen the atomic bomb. They had copied the B-29 bomber to create their 24. They had matched every Western innovation with a good enough Soviet equivalent built faster, cheaper, and in greater numbers. The T-72 tank was the ultimate expression of this philosophy. It was a masterpiece of iteration. It was a T-34 perfected. But the M1 Abrams was a product of innovation. It was not a better version of the M60 pattern. It was a complete rethinking of what a tank was. It was a system of systems. It was a worked weapon. It was a platform built around the survivability of its crew and the supremacy of its information. The Soviets, in their obsession with mass, had built a disposable tank for a disposable crew. The Americans, in their obsession with lethality, had built a survivable platform for an irreplaceable crew. In the 1970s, the Soviet approach seemed practical and the American approach seemed decadent. In 1991, the Soviet approach was revealed to be suicidal and the American approach was proven to be visionary. This technological gap was not just about armor and engines. It was about microchips. The Soviet command economy, with its paranoia and central planning, was incapable of creating the vast competitive and dynamic electronics industry that had given birth to the Abrams fire control computer and thermal sights. They could steal a single microchip, but they could not steal the ecosystem that produced millions of them. They could copy a tank, but they could not copy the philosophy that built it. In the end, the mystery of the M1 Abrams was the mystery of the West itself. The Soviets had looked at the noise, the chaos, the inter-service rivalries, the budget overruns, and the political arguments, and they had seen weakness. They had seen decadence. They had seen a paper tiger. They had failed to see that this chaos was actually the engine of innovation. They had failed to understand that the arguments and the competition were precisely what forged a weapon like the Abrams. They laughed at the turbine engine because their own rigid system would never have allowed such a radical, risky, and fuel-thirsty idea to even be proposed. The legacy of the Abrams is not just a tank. It is a tombstone. It is the tombstone for the idea of mass over mastery. It is the tombstone for the doctrine of the blunt instrument. It is the tombstone for the laugh that echoed in that Moscow briefing room in 1978. That laughter was the sound of an empire that had become fatally arrogant. It was the sound of a system that believed it had solved all the problems of warfare and had stopped asking new questions. The M1 Abrams was the answer to a question the Soviets had never even thought to ask. What happens when the enemy can see you and you cannot see them? The answer, delivered in a howling sandstorm from 3,000 m away, was the real end of the Cold